Hi guys, on this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to do the tubular cast on, and it's a longtail tubular cast on. If you take a look at this sample piece here, this is 1x1 rib as well as this sample, but the difference is on this left swatch I used the longtail tubular cast on, and if you take a look it appears that the ribbing just starts out of nowhere. It's almost an invisible cast on, and it mimics the sewn bind off that I used at the top to finish off my work. And this piece creates a nice piece of knitting that is stretchy. And also, if you take a look, all the stitches are nice and uniform. They're the exact same gauge from the beginning to the end. So you get a very true piece of ribbing. And the gauge stays pretty much the same from beginning to end. Now, if you take a look at this right piece, I just used a longtail cast on, regular longtail, and then a regular bind off in my ribbing. And while this looks okay, I just want to show you the difference here. Our ribbing doesn't really stay the same gauge. It kind of starts almost with all of our knits being next to each other, almost like stockinette, and then it kind of splays out at the top. So it's a little harder to control your piece of knitting when you use a long tail and then finish with a regular traditional bind off. Plus the back of your work, you can see the little purl bumps on the back, which that may be perfectly fine, whatever pattern you happen to be knitting. If it tells you to use a long tail, that's perfectly fine. But for some pieces of work, we want to have a little more control. For example, on a scarf, if you want it to stay, a certain dimension and finish off with the same dimensions instead of being a little more varied as it is with the traditional long tail cast on and bind off. Okay, so I'm going to be showing you this technique today, the longtail tubular cast on. And what we're going to start off by doing is grabbing our needles. And I will tell you, typically for a longtail tubular cast on, it's going to tend to be pretty loose, the cast on. So you may think about going down a needle size or even two, depending on what your particular pattern tells you to do. But for this actual demonstration, I'm going to stick with the same size that we're going to be knitting with. And I'm simply going to be just knitting a little bit tighter with my gauge. And I'll show you how to do that. But for this cast on, we're actually not going to use any waste yarn. On some tubular cast-ons, they're provisional, which just means you use a provisional waste yarn and then you pull it out later on. But for this, we're going to simplify things and just stick with our working yarn, which will make it a lot simpler for us. So we're going to grab that. Okay, and to cast on our work, typically what I like to do is to just measure your finished piece. We have 21 stitches in this swatch, but what I like to do is just stretch it out and get it to the finished dimensions. Take that size and multiply it by 4. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm being a little generous here. Okay, so we're done with that. Now, the first thing we want to do is secure our first stitch. And normally you would use a slip knot when you do a cast on. I don't really like knots in my work, especially on the cast on. So what I like to do is just anchor this first stitch. But the way we're going to be doing it is we're going to just simply twist our yarn. And I'll show you how we're going to do that. The first stitch in our cast on is going to be a purl stitch. So I'll show you how to do a purl anchor stitch. So the first thing we're going to do is just slide our needle under our yarn so that our working yarn coming from the ball of yarn is on the top or to the left, and our tail is coming from the bottom of our needle or to the right. Okay, and then we're simply going to grab both of those strands of yarn and we're going to anchor this loop on our needle with our finger. Okay, so again, working yarn is coming from the top or the left, and our tail is coming from the bottom or the right. Okay, and then we're just going to grab these strands of yarn And if you know how to do a traditional long tail, you know how to hold your yarn like so. So you're going to hold it similar for this technique. Now remember, our first stitch is going to be a purl stitch, so I'm going to show you how to anchor this stitch so that it appears to be a purl stitch. So we're going to secure it with our finger. We're going to draw our needle forward and over that bottom strand, under the bottom strand and the top strand, and come back behind. And if you take a look there, we have a nice twisted stitch that almost resembles a purl stitch. This strand right here coming from the top looks like a purl bump. And remember just to secure that stitch with your finger. So our first anchoring stitch instead of a slip knot is a purl stitch. Now our next stitch for our cast on is going to be a knit stitch. So to do the knit stitch, we're going to, remember, anchor this stitch on your needle so it doesn't go anywhere and cinch up your working strands. Now angle your needle to the front on top of your bottom strand. You're going to scoop under it like so, come back up and go over your top strand, and then go behind it, and then back under your bottom strand. So we've caught that yarn. Now we come all the way back up and cinch our work. And if you take a look, that is our knit stitch. And as you can see, it does look different from our first anchoring stitch. This looks like a purl stitch, this looks like a knit stitch, just as it should. So in our ribbing, we have purl, knit, so the next stitch will be a purl stitch. So we're going to come above our top strand and behind it, underneath, and we're also going to go underneath our bottom strand. Now we're going to come back over the bottom strand, over the top, and back down in between the two yarns and under the top yarn. And then we'll cinch up our work. And there you can see our purl stitch. So you can start to see this ribbing come to life here. We have purl, knit, purl. So next in our sequence is a knit. So remember, this is how we do our knit. Go ahead and secure your 3 stitches here on your needle. For the knit stitch, we go to the front, scoop underneath our bottom strand, come back up between the two, go back over the top, behind the top, and behind the bottom, and then scoop up. And there's our knit stitch. Again, the next stitch will be purl. So we start at the top, go behind both the top and the bottom strand, come over the top of the bottom, go between the two and under the top strand, and cinch up your work. And there's our purl stitch. So it will take a little bit of practice, but before you know it, you'll be picking up speed, and this will just become second nature to you. So it might be a good idea to just practice this before you start your project. But I'll show that to you one more time. Our knit is to go to the bottom, scoop, come back up between the two, over the top and behind and under both. So there's our knit, and then our purl. It's to go behind both, come up over the bottom, scoop back down, and back behind the top. And there's our purl. So we're going to continue to do this. I said we were going to cast on 21 for our sample. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. And remember, we began with a purl stitch, an anchoring purl stitch, so we're going to end with a purl stitch because we have an odd number of stitches. Now, the next step, when we stop in our work, you can see we gave ourselves just enough of a tail there. Now, this last purl stitch is kind of just hanging there. It's not secure, and we want it to be before we can start our next row. So what I do is I just simply take our tail and twist it around our working yarn, just like so, and cinch that up. There we go. That'll make that last purl stitch a little more secure when we knit into it. Okay, now we're going to pick up our other needle and our work, and we're just going to turn it to the right side. And again, remember, this is pretty loose, so we want to keep an eye out on that. Bring our working yarn into position. Now this tail is still a little loose, so what I like to do is just wind it around my pinky just to keep tension on it. We're going to pick up our needle. Now, in our pattern, the way we do a tubular cast on, essentially what we're doing after our cast on is done, we're going to do 2 rows of what's called double knitting. Double knitting is just knitting the front row of stitches and slipping the back, and then we're going to turn our work and knit the back row of the back side of our stitches and slip the front. That may not make sense right now, but it will after I start to show you how we do that technique. So the first thing we're going to do in our double knitting is we're going to knit that first stitch. We'll knit it. Now, we're going to slip that purl stitch and work it when we get on the other side of our work. So you'll put your yarn in the front, you'll go in purlwise, right to left, and you'll slip that purl stitch. Yarn goes back in the back, and we knit the next stitch. Yarn back in the front, slip the purl, yarn in the back, and knit the next stitch. So we continue this, knit, yarn in front, slip, knit, yarn in front, slip, all the way to the end of our row. And again, all we're doing is we're knitting the front of our stitches and slipping the back because we're going to knit those on the other side. Okay, so when we get to the end, knit, slip, and knit that last stitch. Okay, so there is our first row of double knitting complete. Now we're going to turn our work. And for this sample, I'm just going to slip this first stitch because I want a nice little selvage edge. Okay, with the yarn in the front. Now we're going to put our yarn in the back. And remember, we are slipping and then knitting. So we're going to slip this knit stitch with the yarn in the back, and we're going to work the next stitch by purling it. Slip the next stitch, purlwise with the yarn in back, yarn in front, and purl the next stitch. So slip, purl, slip, purl, slip, purl. And we're going to do that all the way across. And the reason this is called tubular is because we are literally creating a tube, and that's why we're slipping our stitches with our yarn in the back. Now when we get to this last stitch, I'm going to knit it. Typically you'd purl it, but remember I'm slipping my stitches for selvage stitches as on my sample. Okay, now if you take a look here, you can see the tube that we've created. We pull it apart here. We've created a little tube by doing those 2 rows of double knitting. And if you happen to lose your place, you can take a look here. You'll see our cast on. It is invisible, but you can see the loop from it right there. And then our first row of double knitting and our second row. So technically we've only done 2 rows, but you will see 3 V's on your working needle. And you know that you've done 2 rows of double knitting. Now we're ready to just continue with our regular ribbing, which is 1 by 1. So again, I'm going to slip my first stitch to keep those nice selvage stitches. And the first stitch is purl, then knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. And if you take a look here, our stitches look really wild and pretty wacky. They're pretty loose right now, but that's because we are knitting from a tube from that tubular cast on. So as I said before, just keep your tension pretty tight because it's going to be really loose, this cast on. And what I tend to do is just kind of stick really close to the tips of my needles to keep my tension a little tighter. Okay, when we get to the end, we knit that last stitch. And there you can see our 1x1 ribs start to appear. We'll turn our work. And you can see it there. There's our tubular cast on. And then you can see our 1x1 ribs start to appear. But after we've worked a little while in our regular 1x1 rib, we're going to have this effect. And as I said, that's how we create that beautiful edge that just seems to roll over to the wrong side of our work. And that was simply by doing that tubular cast on in those first 2 rows in double knitting. But this is how we perform the Longtail Tubular Cast On. I hope this helps you guys.